Hi, everybody. Welcome to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, September 22nd, where we are finishing up the story of an hour, and we are also talking about Rose for Emily. And in Story of an Hour, last class I was talking about how similar it is to A Sorrowful Woman, even though they were written in two radically different time periods. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about the Story of an Hour is its use of symbolism to reinforce the idea of the transformation and the freedom that our main character is experiencing. And in our last attendance question, I asked you to consider what the surname Mallard might signify in this particular piece. You've probably noticed that the text talks about birds and sparrows in particular. So, if you know anything at all about Kate Chopin, you know that she will oftentimes use bird imagery, bird to represent female, that a bird can be entrapped in a cage, much like a female can be entrapped in a home, but a bird could also be released and spread its wings. And that I think is something that we see with Mrs. Mallard as she's peering out that open window. The mallard is a duck, specifically a very common duck, and I would suggest that Mrs. Mallard's experience, even though she's given a specific name in a way that we don't necessarily see in A Sorrowful Woman, that Mrs. Mallard's experience isn't just limited to Mrs. Mallard, but perhaps to other female during this time period as well. And if you know anything about the mallard, you'll know that they oftentimes mate for long periods of time, but the male will oftentimes leave after the children are born. And again, you might say that there could be parallels with human mating. And lastly, if you wanted to think about the colors of a mallard, where the males are quite colorful, but the females are rather drab, and perhaps we could say that that also parallels the human world in the sense that males might be given more attention or more power or more access during this time period than female. But if you think about Joy That Kills, and oftentimes you find irony at the ending of short stories, that twist ending that's the frisson. Of course, we understand what Richards and what Mrs. Mallard's sister do not understand. That she's not necessarily feeling overjoyed over the fact that Brentley Mallard is alive. However, she could be feeling some sense of happiness. After all, she loved him sometimes. But we also know she's going to feel disappointment and she's also going to feel regret because ultimately we saw what they didn't see, and that her heart trouble was relieved over the idea that she no longer had to be oppressed in marriage. All they see is heart disease, not heart trouble. So, one of the reasons why I like to give that particular short story is because it also talks about some of the different ways that you can read it and some considerations. Specifically, did you find Mrs. Mallard to be a sympathetic character? Some readers think she's callous, selfish, and unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in her newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning about her husband's death. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male dominated society. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? And I would suggest yes. Are your views in any way influenced by your being male or female? Does your age affect your perception? And think about that. Age is continually changing. That means your perceptions would continually change. What about your social and economic background? Does your nationality, race, or religion in any way shape your attitudes? Do you have particular views about the institutions of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? Have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other stories, predisposed you one way or another to view Mrs. Mallard? And I think these questions are quite important because it shows the subjective nature of reading and interpreting literature, And I've always wanted to conduct an experiment where I studied this particular text with two different classes. The first would be with newlyweds, and the second being with newly divorced couples. And my suspicion is that I would get radically different impressions about the text. Same text, but different pieces of evidence would probably be highlighted in order to support differing interpretations, which goes to show that there is no one answer in literature. I had a very wise professor in college once say, there are no right answers in literature, but there are some wrong ones. And the wrong ones would be the ones that don't have evidence from the text to support them. But as long as your particular position is possible, then that's considered to be a right answer. So, in terms of thinking about the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics to be worth academic study, A Rose for Emily is definitely one of these canonical works, written by William Faulkner, an author you might have heard of because he also is quite famous in the canon. It also is written in a style that I personally am interested in, that I've probably mentioned to you previously, that I teach a class in Gothic literature. And Gothic literature has certain conventions associated with it. It helped to bring about what we think of in terms of horror. And that said, the Gothic tradition began in England in the 1700s, and basically it was in the 1800s when many seminal Gothic texts that have become part of our cultural makeup were created. And I'm sure you've heard some of these names: Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And part of the reason why they are so famous is because of film. But nevertheless, they established conventions where you would have probably a sense of decay and death. Gothic comes from the term, an architectural term from Gothic. If you've heard of Gothic cathedrals, and they were seen as excessive and barbarian. Gothic also comes from a historical term, and this would be the Germanic Goths, who were seen as barbarians, who were invaders. And again, this idea of excess and barbaric, with the possibility of a supernatural interpretation, but definitely issues of madness and insanity, haunted castles, trapdoors and mysteries, things of that nature. And eventually that tradition moved to the United States. So if you are familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, then you know that also his works very much were written in that style. But there were a group of Southern authors in the United States who became known as Southern Gothic writers. And William Faulkner is one of them. That they were using all of these Gothic conventions, but they were setting these elements not in Britain, but in the South, and using it as a way to make social commentary about the South, which is what we see with A Rose for Emily. Now, the date, 1931, again, to give you an idea of where we are, William Faulkner basically was a Southerner himself and admitted that he was quite embarrassed about his family's legacy with slavery and slaveholding. And he's oftentimes quite critical of it in his writing, as you can see here. One of the things that's interesting about this text is that there is an author interview. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find that author interview online for free, but I will be reviewing it. And I wanted to use that interview as a way to again illustrate the multiple ways that you could examine literature. Because ultimately, even though the author has a particular perspective, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only perspective or even the correct perspective. Some of the things I wanted you to think about with A Rose for Emily is why this story is so complex, because it is, and yet it's very formulaic. If I were to tell you this story in chronological order, it would make perfect sense, but we have a mixed chronology in this piece, and that's very important because Faulkner is trying to hide the ending from us so that we don't anticipate it. And in fact, we have two endings or two climaxes. So if I were to give you the story in chronological order, we have a Miss Emily, who is a fallen Southern aristocrat. She used to come from a family with a good amount of wealth and privilege, but they've fallen on hard times, in part because the Southern system of slavery no longer is in existence, which is how they built their wealth and privilege. She comes from a very domineering family where the father very much controlled her and her relationships. Eventually, he passed away, and she had a very difficult time accepting that. In fact, she held on to his body for 3 days before she was convinced to relinquish it. And then she begins to spend some time with her new freedom by changing her hairstyle and beginning to date. And the person she dates is quite surprising to the community, Homer Barron, because he's a laborer. Remember, she's still a Southern aristocrat, so there's a difference in station here. He also is a Northerner, and of course, she's a Southerner. As they date, there's all kinds of speculation from the community about what is going to happen with their relationship. There even is speculation that perhaps they will marry. At one point, Miss Emily goes to a pharmacist and she buys arsenic, and she needs to supply, from a legal perspective, a reason for buying that arsenic. She refuses to do it, but the druggist supplies it nevertheless, mostly because he's intimidated by her. He says, or he writes on the package, that it's for rats. And then Homer is seen entering into her home and then never seen again. A smell comes out of her home shortly thereafter, and the community, afraid to confront Miss Emily, again, because she's quite intimidating and because she has such a high station, even though she doesn't necessarily have the money that the family used to have, they decide to take care of the smell themselves rather than confront her about the smell. And then she basically becomes a recluse for many, many years until eventually she dies. And then the community is very interested in attending her funeral, mostly because they want to go after the funeral to see her home, because she has been hiding in that house for so long. Basically, she's just had a servant who's gone out and been getting her supplies, a Negro servant, quote unquote. And then ultimately, he disappears as soon as she dies. And then when they enter into the house, they find that there is a locked off room. And in that room, as they open it, they find the corpse of Homer Barron in the bed. So that's the first twist. So again, with the mixed chronology, you might have missed that she actually had murdered Homer. And the assumption is that he wouldn't commit to her. That at one point it mentions that he liked gentlemen. It's less about sexual preference and more about the idea that he wasn't going to have a committed relationship with her. He enjoyed being a bachelor. The second twist, if you were able to anticipate the first twist, is that next to Homer's corpse, which has decayed, of course, is a long strand of iron gray hair. Now, Emily's hair turned gray long after Homer disappeared, which means that she has been lying next to that body long after it decayed. So, necrophilia. And anything that your imagination can conjure up would be much worse than anything that the author could provide for us. So, again, rather than give us the gory details, it's just merely suggested to us. So, in terms of thinking about the story, many readers have talked about the possible symbolism involved in the story, starting with the idea of a rose, with the title, A Rose for Emily. And a rose could be a flower, and a flower can be quite delicate and beautiful, but a flower also has thorns and can be hurtful. And we could perhaps make parallels with Miss Emily herself. Usually when we think about roses, we think about the color red, and the red rose oftentimes signifies love, romance. Red as a color will oftentimes signify things like passion or blood. All of those could be applicable to this story as well, because Miss Emily is acting out because she doesn't have a romantic partner. The idea of rose not being a noun as a flower, and again, the rose is oftentimes not just given in romantic instances, but it could also be given as tributes, perhaps in a funeral, which is how our story starts. But a rose is also a color, and in terms of the rose color at the very ending of the story. We're told about Emily's bedroom, and there are many elements within it that are the rose shade of color. A rose color is neither red nor white, someplace in between. We might say a kind of gray, if we wanted to think about the in-between of black and white that we were talking about with the sorrowful woman. So the idea that the rose could suggest ambiguity, something that's not clearly good or evil, if white represents good and red represents evil. And a rose is also a verb. And the idea of the Southern aristocracy, in order to show respect, that particularly for female gentlemen would rise up when they would when a female aristocrat would enter the room in order to show respect. And that this story very much shows what is happening to this fallen Southern aristocracy as the new generation comes in and really isn't able to give the sort of respect that previous generations did. So what we see is a changing of the times, even though Miss Emily continues to cling on to this dead past of privilege that she once held. So if we wanted to think about that, then we could perhaps think about how Miss Emily might represent the Old South, an old system that is no longer in place, a system of slavery. And that perhaps Homer represents a new North, that not only, of course, if we know our history of the Civil War, that the North defeated the South, but we also know that Homer, as a laborer, is earning his own income through his own labor rather than earning income through the labor of others, which is what slavery was about. Many of these readings are, very common with this piece. And I forgot to mention when I was giving the summary of A Rose for Emily that there also was insanity that ran in the family. So all of that, of course, put together in chronological order makes perfect sense. Miss Emily, we know, lives in this dead past where she refuses free postal delivery. She is trying to teach China painting, even though that is no longer a fad or an interest of the younger generation. She writes in faded calligraphy. There's a section about her taxes that ultimately she is not paying her taxes. And the reason why is because the community has come up with this convoluted story so that she can maintain her honor, that her father had once owed her father had once lent the town money. The town had borrowed it, and that their way of repaying it back was to excuse her from paying taxes. But the reality is that the community knows that she does not have the monies to pay taxes now that her father has died. And rather than confront her, they want her to maintain a certain level of dignity and a certain level of honor. So they create this convoluted story, a story that works until the old generation no longer is in power politically. And now the new generation is requiring their taxes because no one should be exempt from taxes. And what ends up happening is that Miss Emily not only refuses, but she directs them to see Colonel Sartoris, who was the individual who first excused her from taxes. The problem is Colonel Sartoris has been dead for quite a while. So we see that Miss Emily does not live in reality, and she lives in a dead past. And I understand that some of the language in the text might be a little bit difficult to understand. So this would be in the first section, when in the third paragraph we're told alive. Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from the day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes, the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. Only a man of Colonel Sartoris' generation and thought could have invented it. Only a woman could have believed it. Notice the sexism in here. And There is the use of the N word in this piece. I think it's important in terms of understanding the historical time period and the racism and the prejudice that existed. I've always said that a fascinating story would be to hear from the servant, who is silent throughout this piece. But nevertheless, William Faulkner's interview in some ways is disappointing compared to some of the ways that we could perhaps examine this text. And his interview, he's asked at the very beginning, which is not surprising, what is the significance of the title, A Rose for Emily? And his response is, oh, it's simply the poor woman had no life at all. Her father had kept her more or less locked up, and she had a lover who was about to quit her, so she had to murder him. It was a rose for Emily. That's all. And I can tell you that from my perspective, that seems to be a rather unsatisfying answer compared to all of the possibilities that others and I have suggested about symbolism associated with rose. And then Faulkner is asked about what motivated him to write the story, and then afterwards, the interviewer says, "Sir, it's been argued that A Rose for Emily is a criticism of the North. And others have argued saying it's a criticism of the South. Now, this story, shall we say, be more properly classified as a criticism of the times." So before I give you Faulkner's answer, remember the idea of Homer perhaps representing the North. And of course, Homer is not a very attractive character. He basically takes advantage of Miss Emily. He says he likes men, and again, it's because he enjoys being a bachelor and having his fun and not necessarily committing in a time when it was expected that one would be committed. And it could also be a criticism of the South if Miss Emily represents the South, and we definitely see that Miss Emily is suffering from insanity and is clinging to a dead past. Of course, she also commits murder in her attempt to retain something or someone forever. So now this is Faulkner's response to the question. It's been argued that A Rose for Emily is a criticism of the North, and others have argued it's a criticism of the South. Now, could you say the story should be classified as a criticism of the times? Faulkner's answer is, now that I don't know, because I was simply trying to write about people. The writer uses environment, what he knows, and if there's symbolism in which the lover represented the North and the woman who murdered him represented the South, I don't say that's not valid and not there. But it was no intention of the writer to say, now let's see, I'm going to write a piece in which I will use a symbolism for the North and another symbol for the South. That he was simply writing about people, a story which he thought was tragic and true, because it came out of the human heart, the human aspiration, the conflict of a conscience with glands, with the old Adam. It was a conflict not between North and South as much as between, well, you might say, God and Satan. Now, I can stop here and say that the first time I read that, I was rather perplexed, and I was so happy to see that the interviewer was as well, because the interviewer continued by saying, "Sir, just a little more on that one thing. You say it's a conflict between God and Satan. Well, I don't quite understand what you mean. Did one represent the?" And this is the response. "The conflict was in Miss Emily, that she knew that you do not murder people. She'd been trained that you do not take a lover. You marry, you don't take a lover. She'd broken all the laws of her tradition, her background. And she'd finally broken the law of God too, which says you do not take human life. And she knew she was doing wrong, and that's why her own life was wrecked. Instead of murdering one lover and then to go and take another when she used him up to murder him, she was expiating her crime." And then the last question the interviewer asks, was the Rose for Emily an idea or a character? And just how did you go about it? And the answer is, that came from a picture of the strand of hair on the pillow. It was a ghost story. Simply a picture of a strand of hair on the pillow in the abandoned house. And while we don't necessarily have supernatural elements, think about how Emily is haunted by the past. And from a symbolic perspective, perhaps we do have elements of supernatural. Something else to consider about this story is not just the mixed chronology, but the narration. You may or may not have noticed that the story is told in the we. In other words, from the perspective of the community. This is going to be very important because basically we learn more about the community than we do about Miss Emily. And it would be quite interesting to hear Miss Emily's story and her perspective on the events. But what we do know is that the community is not painted in a particularly positive way. They seem to be quite petty, quite superficial, very gossipy. And the way that they respond to Miss Emily is perhaps similar to the way that many individuals respond to celebrity, in that we admire and respect, but we also take a kind of perverse pleasure in downfall. And keep in mind that at one point, this community is speculating, when Miss Emily has gone to the druggist, that she's going to use the arsenic to kill herself. And they just wait to see what happens. They never once try to intervene, which is what you would think someone would do in a close-knit community. That yes, they go to her funeral because of appearances. They want to make sure that they're at the funeral so that it appears that they're being respectful. And also because they're curious, because they know that the funeral will allow access into her home so they can see how she's been living her life all of this time. The druggist, again, sells her arsenic even though he knows he's breaking the law, because it's easier to break the law than it is to try to confront Miss Emily. And he probably has his suspicions as well, perhaps even that she would use it to commit suicide. And again, he does nothing to intervene. So we see throughout this text a very negative portrayal of Southern community, which is typical of Faulkner, which is what he wanted to show us. I mean, certainly we can see how none of these characters are particularly positive. Miss Emily is negative, Homer is negative, but ultimately the community as a whole is the most negative for creating this system of inequality and abuse and misuse. That's not, of course, the only way to read Rose for Emily, but it is at least a way that is quite common. And you can see that in the notes below. I've indicated some of this information. One of the things that you will find is that there is a good amount of foreshadowing, but again, you need to read the text in order to see the foreshadowing, that there is family insanity, there's a dominating father, there's her denial of death, both the Colonel Sartoris and also her father, and ultimately Homer. In fact, it takes her 3 days to give up her father's body. There's a lot of Christian symbolism associated with 3 and Trinity. And Faulkner himself had talked about the idea of God and the religious aspects of this piece. The buying the arsenic, when the druggist writes that it's for a rat, and perhaps in some ways it is, because we could say that Homer is a rat because he refuses to commit to Miss Emily. And then, of course, the disappearance that leads to the smell, that leads to her isolation. All of those are very typical of what you would find in a murder mystery. But because the chronology is mixed up, it's not so easy to identify those. So yes, it does follow a formula. However, that there also are elements of creativity associated with it, much like I had suggested. Shakespeare follows a formula. So a formula fiction piece that is not considered worthy of study, it's more than just that it follows a formula, but it probably doesn't have any kind of depth or sophistication or originality or any kind of grander statement to make. And we can see that A Rose for Emily, while it does follow a formula, it utilizes all kinds of interesting writing and character techniques in order to be able to do more than just give us our typical murder mystery. So the decaying house has oftentimes been seen as a symbol of the decaying South and the decay of Miss Emily herself. And when I think about The Story of an Hour, A Rose for Emily, I thought that this might perhaps be our attendance question for today, which would be due on Saturday, the 24th at noon. And of course, if you need an extension, please let me know. Out of the two stories, The Story of an Hour, A Rose for Emily, which one did you personally prefer and why? And again, this is a question that doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. I'm just more curious in your thinking. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn so that you can get an idea of the class discussion that would have followed. And the last reading that I had assigned for today was the Glossary of Literary Terms, which I believe I've talked about before, that at the back of your text, you've got a glossary. And that's not to say that you can't look up literary terms on your own, but I think it's quite handy if you're using a text to know that many of the literary terms that we are talking about are terms that you can find in the back of your book. So for instance, I had mentioned foreshadowing. And if we were to look up the word foreshadowing in this index, give me a moment here. Foreshadowing. The introduction early in a story of verbal and dramatic hints that suggest what is to come later. So I just wanted you to skim that. Certainly I don't want you to read the glossary, but I want you to be aware that it's there and that you've got terms that you can access. So for next class, because we wanted to move a little bit more quickly, we have 3 short stories that I've selected for us to read, and they're all very different from one another, and that's deliberate. The first is Young Goodman Brown, and this is also part of the literary canon. You might have heard of Nathaniel Hawthorne before, who is the author of Young Goodman Brown, and it's a piece that's set in the 1800s. It also is reflective of New England and specifically Massachusetts. So from that perspective, I think it's a very interesting story so that we can get a sense of some of the history of our locale. And then we've got Soldier's Home, which was written by Ernest Hemingway, another great canonical author, and you've probably heard of Ernest Hemingway before as well. Writing in the 1900s, his writing is much more contemporary than what you would find with Hawthorne. Hawthorne's writing sounds a little archaic, so you're probably going to struggle a little bit through it in a way that you wouldn't with Soldier's Home. Soldier's Home, the title is quite telling that it's about a soldier who comes home after war and trying to reintegrate himself back into civilian society and some of the challenges that he faces. Again, keep in mind when this particular piece was written, we weren't necessarily using terms like PTSD. So in many ways, it was a very revolutionary text. And then Battle Royal, which I had mentioned before, comes from the novel Invisible Man, also from the 1900s. Not The Invisible Man, but Invisible Man, which happens to be the story of a black protagonist who believes that he is invisible because he is not seen for his individuality. He is seen merely by the color or from the color of his skin. And while we don't have time to read the novel in its entirety, the first chapter was released as a short story, Battle Royal, and that's what we will be reading. And in my opinion, it's perhaps one of the best novels, if not the best novel ever written, because of its incredible attention to detail and use of symbolism and metaphor, which is usually what we expect in a short story, but the author was able to maintain that over several hundred pages. So if you ever have the opportunity to read Invisible Man, I encourage you to do so. But Battle Royal talks about this protagonist's review of his early life. And it happens to be an episode after his graduation from high school before he starts college. And what I will do is give you an idea what happens in the novel as a whole next class. Obviously, it'll be very superficial, but at least this will give you a sense of how this particular piece fits into the grander whole. And you can see that in our notes below this video, I've included links that I was able to find online for all 3 of these short stories, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, in the event that you don't have a text. But keep in mind that I also have our textbook on reserve in the GCC library. So again, for your attendance question, which story did you prefer out of the two that we've been discussing? The Story of an Hour or Rose for Emily, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.